Welcome to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp, President of Sharp Research and Translation. Our guest today is Dr. Ian Forsyth. He's an associate at Booz Allen Hamilton, a very famous consulting company. And our title today is China, APEC and Beyond. Welcome to ThinkTech Asia.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. Well, the recently concluded APEC, the Beijing APEC, China really went all out, didn't it, to how should we say, impress the world, make its presence known, remind people that it's on the rise? How would you characterize it?
I think that's a good way of putting it. Well, first off, allow me to say thank you for having me. And secondly, I should preface my comment by saying this is purely my own comment, my own insights. No, I'm not representing Booz Allen Hamilton or our clients in any way. So
fair enough.
Pure Ian.
Pure Ian.
Pure Ian. So I think I would agree with your characterization of almost being a diplomatic coming out party, because I think the analysis and commentary we've seen about the People's Republic of China in the last several years has been, as a rising power, is it quite yet a major power? Certainly not quite a superpower, but the standards of measurement, the things that a lot of the analysis has looked at, has been its economic growth and its economic size, and I think that's been undeniable. And so in that sense, it checks the box as a major power. Secondly, military, and I think people have seen its military modernization, its growth with some alarm, but they see that as also sort of satisfying that category of being a major power. It has certain trappings, I think certain symbolic elements, I think, of being a major power, things like hosting an Olympics, a major space program, a carrier. But now we've seen diplomatically, that was always, I think, sort of the weakest link in that power chain, if I may. And I think
the diplomatic part.
Yeah, I think China has not really been a major diplomatic player, at least not to the level of ability that one would expect from a major power. I mean, being able to host or drive major diplomatic negotiations, settlements. I mean, I think the best example, you could never see China hosting or running anything like a Dayton Peace Accords.
Why is that? Why is it that China hasn't stepped up diplomatically until perhaps
now?
Until
I think APEC is a major step forward. But I think prior to that, I think it's been mostly Chinese priorities, national security priorities, and I think diplomatic mindset, diplomatic approaches. I mean, obviously it doesn't have any real security alliances. I mean, it had a sort of semi-security alliance with North Korea that it forged in the 60s, but I think that's being generous to call it a security alliance.
And that's a documented treaty that some Chinese scholars and think tankers have suggested, forget it, it's old,
Absolutely.
Let's get rid of it. It's only creating problems.
Absolutely. And I think that, and then a tradition of non-interference with other countries' affairs, a tradition of generally abstaining in the UN Security Council votes. I think you haven't had a cultivated ability of real diplomatic training and diplomatic sort of guidance. So
let me just pick up a point that you made, because I think it's an important one. Now, traditionally, since the 1950s, the Bandung Conference, to be precise, part and parcel of Chinese foreign policy has been this premise about we do not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. But as I look around the globe, I think that this aspect of Chinese foreign policy is fading into history. What's your take?
No, I agree. In fact, I would say that's an easy thing for them to say. I mean, that's not completely true of them to say that, I think, because obviously the issue of Taiwan recognition or Beijing recognition, I think, is one thing where they would interfere. Obviously, that guides a lot of their diplomatic interaction, is first recognize China as being, the one China. But I think secondly, it's having to change just by virtue of the amount of global interests that China has. And I think as Chinese capital goes global and as Chinese labor goes global, I think it's impossible to not have a greater interest. And you look at, I think you look at Libya and some of the non-combatant evacuation operation that China had to guide out of there. And you see so much of their labor forces going out to frankly, some unstable areas, because that's where the resources are.
Right.
I think it's going to necessitate, and as you said, I agree that it is having to alter somewhat or amend somewhat that sort of blanket non-interference.
I can think of a couple of examples right off the top of my head here. Burma, Myanmar, whatever your choice is, I mean, clearly was very friendly with China up until recently. And it did 180 on China. And China was pretty much involved in Burmese internal affairs. And they said, well, we're going to dam this river, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Things that they have, they transgressed the border with Sikkim. Okay, that was a clear violation. It was something that they had agreed to, the borders they had agreed to. I'm always very wary of what they're doing in northern Laos.
Yes.
I think that's interference. They have, 3,000 troops stationed in the Sudan, guarding Chinese oil assets. Now, if the government of the Sudan should decide to nationalize those, are those troops just going to sit there? I think that's a stretch of the imagination.
Great point. No, that's an excellent point.
And so I think that, as you suggest, China, it's very easy for China to say, but the reality is, and I agree with you, is as China becomes more about a power, this is just a harder component of their foreign policy to follow.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's almost mutually exclusive to have these kind of global interests, this kind of stature, and this kind of presence, and then still maintain a complete hands-off mentality. Now, maybe that means they're going to be less vocal about high politics within a certain host country. But as you say, I mean, absolutely they're involved. I mean, you look at the Mekong Dam and the kind of Mekong Delta, the river, and how much damming they're engaged in. Obviously, that's affecting those countries, and it's not like they're conferring to at least to the level they should be. So, but I think it's an impossible. I think it's an impossible balance to maintain. But like I said, I don't think they really have the training or the history to do it. I mean, to really have that sort of sophisticated. But who knows? When with the APEC summit, we are seeing that change somewhat. So
they're new with the diplomatic game, relatively speaking.
Yes.
Okay. Well. Okay. You're suggesting then what the biggest thing that China got out of APEC 2014 was it established its diplomatic credentials. But what's the role that you see China playing in Asia? What's its regional image? What's its regional role?
Well, I think its role really is determined first and foremost by its economic gravity. I mean, it is such an economic vital partner to every country within that region. And I think that drives those countries' interests vis-a-vis China. I think also the economic interest sort of goes both ways, because I think it drives China's, I wouldn't say it drives China's relations with these countries, but it's a card that China knows it can play with other countries. So when you have things like territorial disputes that we have, let's say notably in the South China Sea, I think it allows China a certain amount of confidence that they could do things regarding territorial claims, like, rebuilding some of, I should say building up some of the islands in the South China Sea, like Fiery Cross Reef, or put a oil rig not too far off the Vietnamese coast, knowing that it's going to result in some, informational diplomatic, pushback from competing claimant countries. But the economic leverage that it has, it's economic, it's almost a form of identity, I think. It's economic power. I think it relies on that, and it has that card it can play and say, well, you can dislike this all you want, but you can only push us so far, and because you're economically dependent on us. I think that's a big element regarding Taiwan as well.
Another thing that strikes me, I think that's true, and this is true, I think, of countries in Asia and as well as Taiwan, is as much as certain segments of a population might be very upset and very outspoken about China's actions, there's another component, usually the ones getting the most economic benefit or who are sort of behind the scenes silently supporting China, or at least not criticizing it, or trying to influence the respective government to tamp down its criticism so as not to upset the economic boat. China is very good at playing business interests, I've always felt. And it doesn't matter what country it is. I mean, Taiwan, as you mentioned, is a very good example. There's the well, maybe I'm a bit sarcastic when I say it, but the comprador class in Taiwan,
A good way to put it.
that China has played very skillfully. The same thing isn't true in Hong Kong. Same thing's true in the United States, frankly. They're very good at that, and those people act as a brake on on certain policies, be it in America or wherever, that China might not like.
I couldn't agree more. I think it really is a form of lobbying when you think about it. It's an excellent
Sure.
business lobby.
Yeah.
And you see that debate, I think, most acutely within countries, again, that have territorial disputes with China, particularly in the South China Sea. I think those rival claimants, where you find that debate sort of at its most stark and its most laid out. I think you've definitely seen that with Vietnam, with Malaysia, the Philippines, where there's, and I think even Australia to a certain extent, it has to balance undeniable.
Sure.
But I think an interesting side effect is this, is what these countries then, what they're dealing with China is pure dollars and cents. They're not responding to China in a diplomatic, soft power way. They're not, those aren't the levers they're responding to. And this, I think, hurts China's ability to cultivate in a long term skilled diplomatic capabilities. Because Chinese, I mean, they're basically using pretty blunt instruments, either our economic power or an implied use of force. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. And you know, the other thing is that, in a sense, the Cold War was a lot easier, right? I mean,
Well,
it's like,
absolutely it
these
was,
guys are
yeah.
here, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. There's not much in the middle. Now it's sort of like, it's so fluid. It's like, oh yeah, well, they're the bad guys, but wait a second, we get a lot of money from them, so maybe they're not so bad. Well, today they're bad, tomorrow they're good. This just goes back and forth, and I think that, you know, sometimes America is criticized because, well, we don't know if we can trust you guys. You guys might be leaving. Well, you're not showing us enough of your stuff here. But on the other hand, some of these countries are also not showing America enough of its stuff. I don't think it's, oh yeah, we really want your security blanket here. Oh, wait a second, we're gonna do business with these guys. Back off a little bit now. No, wait, that's not a threat. That's not so much of a threat. Oh, wait, this is a threat, so jump
Sure.
in. It's sort of like back and forth. And you know, this just creates an environment where I think it's very easy to misread and misguess, and that's potentially dangerous.
absolutely. And I think it's tough because, I mean, here I've talked about Chinese lack of sort of diplomatic training or diplomatic sophistication. I think in some ways we have a similar problem in the United States, in that I think so much of our mindset in terms of whether it's, I don't know if it's training in school and college, you know, when we were in graduate school and undergraduate, the Cold War framed so much of how we learned international relations.
That's a good point.
And I think that's part of it is, and maybe there's something about the American character, I don't know, I'm not, you know, really a sociologist, but that wants to see things in terms of, you know, villains, heroes,
Yeah.
victims, black, white, like you said.
We're the saviors. We do have a bit of that kind of complex, I think.
Sure, and I think we have a certain history to, in a sense, to back it up, which China does not. I think that also hurts its soft power, I might add. But I do think, in a way, yeah, we have that problem as well, where we've, unlike a lot of the countries that we're dealing with in the region, we're very, very powerful. We can decide our own fate to a much greater degree than they can. We're not having to, you know, rely on the good graces or even the feelings of others. I mean, I think a lot of the Cold War has been that history. I'm not saying that we've been insensitive so much, but I am saying that, I mean, we've just had that luxury that they haven't. And so, to our detriment, I think that hurts our ability. Now, again, I do think you're right, we get some mixed signals. And some of the interactions I've had with, particularly in Southeast Asia, but Korea as well, some other Northeast Asia.
Korea
they
sends a
went
lot
both
of
ways.
mixed messages, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I constantly, sort of like, reading the Korean tea leaves is a bit of a challenge sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't pretend to be able to read them. But I think what makes it sort of complicated on another level is a lot of these countries, and probably most notably China, a lot of their national identity, I think, is based on sort of being able to stand up for themselves, but also having to recognize a certain amount of dependence. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard, I think, for particularly a country like Korea, which has a sense of, I think, of having been oppressed by Japan,
Right.
but also, you know, knowing that it is a modern country by most
Right.
standards of measurement. I think that makes it very complicated for all, and I think China is probably the most acute example of this, is where on one hand there's a history of pride and 4,000 or 5,000 years of continuous civilization and incredible influence throughout the region and real, almost a cultural center of gravity. But also, they will never hesitate to remind you of the 100 years of humiliation at the hands of foreigners. And it's just, I mean, that's a really hard balance to reconcile, I think, is you're both a victim and you're this, the most important thing in the region.
Let's come back to that point because we have to take a break right now. You're watching ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Ian Forsyth. He's an associate at Booz Allen Hamilton. The title of our show today is China, APEC, and Beyond, and we'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroots Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right and what's good and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Ian Forsyth, associate at Booz Allen Hamilton. And we've been talking about China in the wake of APEC 2014, which China went all out to host. In fact, I heard it said that China spent as much, if not more money, on APEC 2014 as it did for the 2008 Olympics. They really put a lot of there was a lot of planning that went on for this. I mean, this was not something they just jumped into lightly.
Yeah, well, I think again, it's part of their new sense of developing into major power identities. This is what major powers do. Again, we have expensive Olympics, and now we have expensive APEC summits, and they can claim that they've helped reinvigorate the whole APEC institution.
That's an interesting point. But, America, in a sense, looked weak, didn't it, at APEC? I mean, Obama sort of straggles into Beijing after the staggering rout of the midterm elections, and he looked pretty, he didn't create a big image. He didn't leave a big footprint there, it seemed to me.
Yeah, it's tough because there's the sort of personification of the United States in the form of Obama. And then there's the United States itself. And it's sort of tough because they can easily, I think America can look weak in a lot of sort of local Asian eyes, when they see a lot of political discord and it's very visible, it's very intense at times. And I think Obama, that probably did tar him. I think if you looked at a lot of the local op-eds, you would come across a lot of the commentary saying, oh, he's a wounded president, he's a lame duck, he just lost, really got trounced. But I do think, though, that didn't stop them from thinking that the climate change agreement was the work of probably a strong U.S. president and a strong Chinese president / general secretary. So it's sort of, it's sort of a tough thing to balance. But
I'm sort of skeptical about that agreement on climate. I mean, China's never been really big on environmental issues, and
that's no kidding.
I'm just going to wait to see how that one pans out.
That's it's interesting. Again, I'm skeptical as well because of the history of environment really being sacrificed at the altar of economic growth in China. I certainly was impressed by at least. God, maybe it just was the pomp and circumstance, but it's such a contrast to Copenhagen of a few years ago.
I agree with you. It at least was a step beyond that.
Yes, and maybe
I'm not sure how big of a step, but some sort of a step.
I know. Maybe if we just really have low expectations, we start from a low operating base, then we'll be happy. But I certainly hope. I mean, the world needs it, so I hope it works out.
Well, actually, I was going to ask this question a little bit later, but I think now is a good time to insert it. When I go to China, and I go to university to university, think tank to think tank, and talk to China's experts on the U.S.-China relationship, or those that Chinese that specialize on Taiwan issues, they invariably ask me, why is it that you Americans want a position in Asia? I just don't get it. Why is it that you want to be here? And you probably have heard this question as well.
Absolutely.
And my response is, oh, come on, you guys are informed enough to know the answer to that. You really don't have to ask me. But I think they're sort of bound in by sort of, certain guidelines or certain points. If they're meeting a foreigner, they have to talk about. And how would you respond to that question? Now, you probably had an opportunity to respond to it.
Yeah, I have to admit, I've come across more than my share of, at times, questions that seemed a little, I don't say obvious, but rudimentary, and at times ill-informed, even from scholars who spent substantial time in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I had to characterize the view, I would say most think they can understand why the U.S. has been here, Cold War, balancing the Soviet Union, alliances with Japan. But I would sort of put a twist on it and say they don't understand why we're staying here to the degree at least at the security level, at least in terms of security relationships with Japan and South Korea and Australia. I certainly come across that as among a lot of very sophisticated Chinese America watchers is the Cold War is over. There's certainly nothing really threatening the sea lines of communication going into the South China Sea, despite what the U.S. at times alleges. So why are you still having this mindset, and why are you trying to sort of stoke it and keep it artificially alive? With client states like the Philippines or maybe Thailand or Burma. I think it's not so much they don't understand why we're there, it's like why we're still there.
You know what my response was last summer in Shanghai? I talked to this one Chinese researcher who when I go to China, I like to talk to because he spent his whole life studying about Taiwan. And I actually, sometimes I find that his perspective and my perspective have striking similarities. But he posed this question on me last summer. And I said, well, come on, let's get real here. You guys are bullying other countries in Asia. And he was like, wow, bullying? What do you mean bullying? I said, well, the PLA, there's nothing bullying other countries. You've had such a massive military buildup, and you're scaring other countries. I said, and you guys don't really you're so worried about your 100 years of shame that you do not realize the other experiences with imperialism and colonialism that countries in the region have had, and you're just trampling all over them. And, well, he listened pretty closely, and to some degree, I think he agreed, but of course, as free thinker as he might be, there's always certain limitations to where he can go. But I mean, China's really sort of trampled over countries in Southeast Asia. On one hand, it's handing out money and trade deals and manufacturing deals. And as you suggested, in large part, the economies of Southeast Asia have been integrated with China's economy. But on the other hand, they're running roughshod over countries in Southeast Asia. Philippines is only one case. Vietnam's another. Burma, we talked about earlier. Well, Cambodia is, I think it's fair to say, a client state. And Laos is somewhere as close to that category. Well.
No, I think you raise a good point in that I think there's still a fair amount of, I hate to homogenize and sort of group a whole community of analysts and scholars in one group, but I am disappointed in how shocked they are that of the reactions that their own policies yield. Particularly, like you mentioned Burma or Myanmar, when you had a lot of the local protests against the dams and the pipeline and the oil pipeline. The Chinese were really caught off guard and couldn't believe it. And they said, wait, how could you dislike all this huge gift we're giving you of direct investment into your infrastructure? And it's just, I found that baffling that they would be so surprised. I'm not saying they have to like it, but the fact they were so shocked is just...
This is very similar to their problem in Tibet, if you ask me, because Tibet, they always say, we can't understand these Tibetans. We brought them economic benefits. You know, they don't work. They're lazy. They don't do this. They don't do that. They don't appreciate it. Well, their culture is different. They're not so much into the economic benefits. They're into religion and spirituality, and you guys aren't.
Yeah, and I think and I'm glad that in your discussion you recounted that you mentioned how many of the other countries were victims of colonialism. I mean, it's funny. I mean, that whole region's been humiliated and bullied. I mean, China, that very much I think is part of the national identity is, and not to downplay that. I mean, obviously that was some terrible atrocities, particularly like the Nanjing massacre or even the Opium War. I mean, there's no reason to have a war like that. But all these other countries, when it comes to victimization, they can step in line in front of China. I mean, they were colonies of Western power. I mean, complete colonies.
Right.
So I think China needs to sort of, you know, it makes you want to say, join the club.
Yeah.
You know, you were oppressed by Western powers. Look around you.
Yeah.
You know, Vietnam, Malaysia.
In an odd sort of way, I sometimes think that China's policy towards Southeast Asia is very similar to Japan's in World War II. Well, let's have the greater brotherhood, the co-prosperity style, this time Chinese style.
Yeah, there's a certain concern that, and again, I think it goes back to their lack of soft power. And I think one thing that concerns me about China in this issue, I mean, I've been looking at China probably since the late 80s when I started college as an Asian Studies major, is I think China is sort of becoming more and more realpolitik, and it's recognizing its own power, and it's not wanting to use that power for good. And I'm not saying that it should be like Superman and that it needs to have its message to say, you know, you will now take care of all these countries with a noble cause. But I am saying
That's
that
American style.
Exactly. But it's been the victim, and now that it has the power that it's not the victim, it's being as nakedly powerful and in a Thucydides type way. I think throwing that power around in the region.
Very Machiavellian.
Very Machiavellian. And I find that very disappointing, and it makes me more and more pessimistic. I've become more and more pessimistic over the years, unfortunately.
I think, you know, in one of our discussions before the show, I think that your views are shared by what we might call very leading China watchers in Washington, who probably had greater hopes for China to be more, frankly, more democratic, and not particularly happy with the road that China's evolving, traveling down. I sometimes think the problem is, I think it was especially true of, you know, the first and second generation of Chinese leaders, post-liberation, of course. Not very educated, but very intelligent, very well read, usually in some chapter of Chinese history.
Yeah.
And I think that this, although this leadership, the fourth and fifth generation, are certainly much, much better educated, and not all engineers. They have, you know, studied a diversity of subjects as graduates and undergraduates.
Yeah.
But I still think they have this tendency to look to the past, and not so much the future, or at least not as much to the future as they sometimes do to the past. And this whole idea about re-exerting the Chinese sphere of influence in Southeast Asia, this is looking to the past to me. This is not looking to the future.
No, I think you're right, and that goes to what we've talked about earlier, I think, to a certain extent, that they're finding identity in this glorious past, and I think it's sort of all under heaven, or what they used to call Tianxia.
Yeah.
The all under heaven. And I think, and where you had, in a way, these countries were tributary states. So...
the tributary system, Act Two.
Yes, and that's, and gosh, I have to catch myself. I don't want to seem too condemning of China, but I think it's undeniable that you have those elements there in the worldview, that is the natural order of things. I mean, and again, that doesn't mean there aren't pragmatists who can play a more sort of modernistic game of international relations. But I do think you have that view that this is the way things are, and then there was a certain retardation of growth, and for a few, you know, a couple of hundred years perhaps, and now this is the natural order of things. So, and even if that's the case, my comment would be, even if that were the case, that you are clearly the most powerful country in the region, that doesn't mean you have to act this way regarding disputes. It doesn't mean you can't follow treaties and law and dispute resolution through, you know, international institutions as opposed to naked power.
Very good points. Let's go on and talk about the rebalance AKA the pivot.
Yeah.
Where are we? Where are we in this rebalance pivot thing? Are we really rebalancing? Are we really pivoting? Or is this just all rhetoric?
Well, I think it's more than rhetoric. I think the problem was, in a sense, when it was first articulated, I don't know how clearly thought out and conceived it was. I mean, I always had a sense, and again, this is just purely from my vantage point working out here, that some of it was, to a certain extent, now that we are pulling back from the Middle East and the Iran-Iraq war, which consumed so much of our efforts, diplomatic, military, security
Financial.
efforts. Yes. Although that probably isn't ending.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think part of it was, okay, this is what we'll use to fill the void. Is this, obviously we have interests in East Asia. So unfortunately, I think there was a little bit of that. It was a bit of a plan B. Which isn't a really good way to start a plan. I think it's real. I mean, you have obviously the movement of the Marines to Darwin. You're having a more robust military relationship with the Philippines. I think with having more sort of exchanges and forces in Singapore. I think that's genuine, and I think you could qualify that as being part of the rebalance. But after that, I'm not sure what the end state is meant to be. Like, what is it meant to achieve? I mean, I guess you could say that it's always meant to achieve a certain amount of reassurance of our neighbors. So you had mentioned how so many countries in the region have this insecurity. Well, don't leave us. On one hand, don't be too oppressive or don't be too obnoxious, but don't leave us either.
Right.
So I think it's certainly meant to achieve that. And I think you'll see that in other elements too. I think if a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is signed and if that is put into place, I think that would definitely be a major pillar of the rebalance. I think if we can't get that, then I think you could argue that the rebalance has been, would get a C-, D+.
Let's hold that thought and come back to that, because we need to take another break. You're watching ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Ian Forsyth, associate at Booz Allen Hamilton. We have been talking about China in the wake of the APEC 2014, which China hosted just a few months ago in Beijing. We'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevlin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday. Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Ian Forsyth, associate at Booz Allen Hamilton. We have been talking about China in the aftermath of the APEC 2014, which China hosted in Beijing just a few months ago. And just before we went to break, we were talking about what depends on your choice of words, but the rebalance or the pivot to Asia, a policy being carried out by the United States. And I think another problem with the rebalance is a lot of these countries have grown up, right? Mm-hmm. And they really don't want to take orders in the way that they used to. And so they want your help, but they want to question it at the same time. And I think in the Cold War, policy execution was a lot easier. The countries weren't as developed. They probably weren't as self-confident as they are now. And it was easier to dish out orders. It's a whole different game now.
I would agree with that. I think it goes back to what we were saying of how, in a way, how much easier it was in the Cold War.
Right.
You just had this sort of bifurcation
right.
of interests and parties, and you were one or the other. And I guess you could try to be non-aligned, but that didn't always work.
Right.
But I think that's true, and I think also that in a way plays, I think, somewhat to China's advantage, because their rise, I think, of a lot of the countries in the region has probably coincided with China's rise, and by rise I mean their economic growth, I guess I should say, and they've benefited a lot from China's economic growth. In a way, at least if you look at the naked economic numbers at our expense, I mean, you look at, whether it's even close allies like Taiwan or Japan, China has really just overtaken us as the major trade partner for most of these countries. So I think that's part of it, is they have, you know, a greater sense of identity. They're not part of Cold War framework, and they're growing, but a lot of that growth is linked to the growth of China.
Let me ask you the proverbial $64,000 question here. Salami slicing.
Yeah.
Chinese style. Now, for the benefit of our audience, salami slicing essentially means the Chinese way of going about foreign policy by seeking not to make huge steps forward all at one time, but tiny steps, look around and see if anybody's paying attention. If not, another tiny step, etc. I think Washington is really confounded of how to deal with salami slicing. And I recently read something by Admiral Dennis Blair. I think a lot of people throughout the country, especially here in Hawaii, remember him as a previous Pacific commander, very, very bright, Rhodes Scholar, Russia scholar by background, as well as surface warfare officer. And I guess since his PACOM days, spent a lot of time thinking about problems in Asia, and was the director of national intelligence, and until he had a bit of a fallout with the White House.
Wow.
But he was asked in an interview, I forget exactly where I read this, like, Admiral, how do you deal with salami slicing? He said, that's a good question. None of us can figure it out. Here's your chance. Right here on ThinkTech Asia.
Well, I'll tell you, before I answer, maybe I should be named Director of National Intelligence or something first, because what a waste of having a good answer if I'm just sort of a nobody. But you know, I don't see how you can. That's what makes, in a way, and here I've been criticizing China's diplomatic acumen, but I think in terms of dealing with a great power like the United States, salami slicing really is the ideal policy, because you can't respond to it. It's a single slice. I mean, it's so small. That's not enough to warrant a real slapdown by the superpower, i.e., the United States. So but you still have an accumulated effect of where you've changed the status quo. Mm-hmm. But none of the individual slices is enough to warrant serious U.S. response.
Right.
I mean, so it really is a brilliant tactic. Right. I mean, it really is. I mean, now obviously, I think it's very much aimed at the United States, because I don't think they really care if the Philippines or Vietnam thinks that it's, you know, overbearing, or that it affects their interests. And I don't think that really goes into China's calculus. I don't think they care if they offend those countries. But with the United States, it's perfect, because it's just large enough where when you add them up, it changes the status quo. And I think things like the ADIS announcement.
Exactly my next question.
Well.
Okay, the ADIS, in other words, area, I got to think what this stands for all of a sudden. Aerial denial.
Identification.
Yeah, there we go. I'm so used to calling it ADIZ that I forgot exactly what the acronym stands for. When China first established it, and the United States sent its bombers out from Okinawa, and you really didn't hear much of China. That was one slice. And then I think they just sort of sat back and saw what everybody was doing. And now it sounds like they want to start enforcing the ADIZ. And what should the U.S. do, or if anything?
Probably depends. I would think it would depend on a case-by-case basis, because technically they're allowed to have an ADIS. I mean, ADIS as a form of international practice, it's not really codified. I mean, it's really not a developed area of international law. I mean, I know the Chicago Convention talks a little about things of that nature, but other than that, it's kind of rudimentary. So it gives China flexibility to create something and not say that it's violating a specific code. I think it would probably depend on almost a case-by-case how China is doing. And I think realistically, I'm not sure the difference would be any difference in terms of U.S. response than how China reacts now to the U.S. Intelligence surveillance, ISR. Yeah, exactly, into China's EEZ. So I think it would probably, the response would probably be something along those lines. I mean, it does concern me that you see what they're doing in the South China Sea in terms of being able to fortify rocks really out there. Was it the Nanji Island? They're putting more sort of enforcement mechanisms there for East China, for their East China Sea ADAs.
Right.
That is disconcerting. I think China could easily overplay its hand because, boy, if China looks like it was militarizing and essentially taking over those zones and enforcing it, beyond any kind of accepted norm, China could overplay its hand pretty quickly.
It seems to me the tripwire for the United States could be if China interferes with freedom of navigation, because that seems to be the big thing the U.S. has emphasized. They're willing to sort of, look the other way, if you want to put it that way, on a lot of issues. But freedom of navigation, this is the bottom line, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, that really is the $64,000 answer is freedom of navigation, because that's not just a U.S. interest, that's a global interest.
We defend the interests of our allies by defending freedom of navigation. And I think it's, our allies depend on us. I mean, if there's a good reason for the U.S. to be in East Asia, or at least one of the good reasons, is to maintain freedom of navigation.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's been, and it's funny, that's been part of the benefit that China has is, I guess you can call China a free rider for some of these decades.
Oh, I think that's a fair comment.
Has been our maintenance of the sea lines of communication, of shipping lanes, and a certain amount of sort of a stabilizer for the region. China's very aware of this because they're very keen to point out that they are not threatening sea lines of communication, and that's a red herring argument that the U.S. is leveling. But to do so, I mean, that would be getting close to piracy, I think, if China were to.
Point.
But the problem is, and I don't think China understands the U.S.'s concerns, or at least if they are, they're disregarding them. But you look at the logical extension of China's legal analysis of its rights in the region, of sort of the 9-dash line and what rights it derives from that, which I think will be ruled, sort of not valid under international law by The Hague. But I think when you look at the logical extension, then they would be able to interfere with these sea lines of communication if you play out China's legal analysis. And that's what I think drives U.S. concerns. But boy, China would almost be declaring war on the world if they were to interfere with some kind of shipping.
I think for the benefit, this is I think a rather important point that, one of the most important points we made here today. And I think for the benefit of our audience, freedom of navigation essentially means, enabling the economy to operate smoothly.
Absolutely.
The freedom of navigation means the free flow of goods, natural resources, oil from the Middle East, etc. And countries, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, would be hurt without that freedom of navigation. So it's a crucial point.
I think that's really the key. And that's, again, I think that is the red line that China could cross, and it would sink every effort that China has made, I think, in cultivating trust or goodwill with the regions if it in any way gets involved with those.
Well, we're coming down here to our closing moments, and maybe it's a little unfair to toss this question at you close to the end here, but let's see what we can do with it. How should the U.S. engage Asia, or China, I should say? I mean, should it seek to engage China? Should it work out an agreement with China that essentially creates a division of power in Asia? Should it hold China at arm's length? Should the U.S. just get out of Asia?
Well, I think there's no getting around that. I think that it has to engage China fully and comprehensively, certainly economically. I mean, the U.S. derives too much economic benefit from a robust relationship with China. I think that the U.S. has to maintain and be clear that it's a steadfast supporter of its treaty allies, most notably Japan and Australia, but also the Philippines. I mean, within reason, it can't be a blank check provider, but it has to be unequivocal about that. I think the U.S., its best technique, I think, if you want to call it that, for dealing with China, is almost strengthening the rest of the region, and not in an anti-China alliance way, because that would really play into China's concerns that we're trying to contain them. And this isn't containment, not in the George Kennan sense of the way. But I do think that means strengthening relationships with other countries and helping them help themselves, and pushing for international institutions for problem solving.
Much of that we're doing right now. I mean, all that started with Kurt Campbell, the father of the rebalance or pivot. I can't wait to read his book when it comes out.
Yeah.
You know, there is, but I just controversial point here at the end. You know, a lot of the U.S. pivot rebalance has been based on the notion we've got to be in Asia. That's where the economic future of the world is. But then when I look at Japan, I mean, it's been in the doldrums for 20 plus years. South Korea, on one hand, looks like it's doing great. You see Samsung products everywhere, Hyundai's and filling the streets of every city and lots of countries. Kia's all over the place. But the domestic situation in South Korea, I don't think is all that bright. And it did, you know, it was pretty hard hit during the Asia financial crisis, which I don't think we should forget about. Taiwan, a tiger, a lion, a dragon, whatever you want to call it, but I don't hear many people calling it that these days.
No.
And China, you know, the days of 8% growth are gone. I was watching a Chinese news show the other day and said, well, look, and they were trying to be realistic on this show. They said, look, we're in the period of 6% growth, and maybe it'll be less than that. And all kinds of other issues that China has to deal with. Plus, there's always the thing, the perpetual Chinese concern for maintaining stability, because I think that China is this an inherently fragile state that actually could fall apart fairly easily. So are we really putting all our eggs in the right basket here? Or is this just the best possible choice available to us?
I don't know if so much that we're putting all our eggs in one basket, but I do think for the last point you hit on, which is China's own stability, you know, or what they call Wending, I think absolutely that drives our interest there, because no one wants to see a failed China. I mean, no one wants to see a country that's unstable. I mean, I've had a lot of discussions with friends about how fragile the regime is. I think it's relatively, I don't want to call it stable, but safe, because I don't see an alternative to the Communist Party in China.
Well, that's a good point.
So, but I think we just have to.
You know, like always, there's always more to talk about than there is time. And unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. So I'd like to thank our guests today for being with us, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. And we'll see you next week right here, same time, same place on ThinkTech Asia.